So let me ask you about this. I mean, just in terms of the non-aggression principle, how in the world that you imagine, how does one maintain property rights?
Well, in my view, as a anarcho-capitalist, there would be private defense agencies that had police forces or armies. And if you stole my wallet, for example, let's say, and my wallet is legitimately mine, I would call the police. I would call the private police agency, and they would come get you and make you disgorge the wallet and punish you according to libertarian punishment theory. If I were a minarchist, I would just call the government and I'd say, "Hey, Sam stole my wallet. Go get him." And if Sam said, "No, I didn't really steal it," then we would have to adjudicate it through the court.
Now, so well, okay, that raises a couple of questions for me. I mean, the first being that, I mean, who gets to determine if you're not a minarchist or
minarchist?
A minarchist. If you're not a minarchist, who gets to determine whether or not I really stole your wallet?
Well, we would have a series of competing courts. And let's suppose you deny that you stole the wallet. You claim that I stole it from you yesterday and you're just repossessing it or something like that. Well, you would go to your court, call it Court A, and you would invite me to go to Court A, and I'd say, "What? Court A? That's your brother or your mother. I'm not going to Court A." And I would go to Court F. F is in Frank. And I would invite you to come to my court, and you say, "What? Court F? That's your mother, your brother, your friend, whatever. I'm not going." And now and then we would each go to our own courts. And now it's possible that both, and when you go to a court, you sign an agreement that you'll obey or abide by what the court says. Now it's possible that both courts will agree with you, in which case it's sort of case closed. Both courts and police will, come after me because they both agreed with you, or vice versa. It's possible that both courts will agree with me, in which case, you'd better give me that wallet back because not only my court, but your court - police will come after you. Okay, so the more interesting case is suppose the courts disagree. Now, one possibility, which we won't consider, is that my court agrees with you and your court agrees with me. Let's forget about that for the moment. And let's assume that your court agrees with you and my court agrees with me. Now, Ayn Rand, who is a minarchist, says at this point, blank out. You anarchists, libertarians. By the way, the debates among libertarians are pretty ferocious. She says, blank out. Then what happens? The courts fight. And the answer to that, coming from my quarter of libertarianism, is no. There are two types of courts. One type of court, we call them legitimate courts, are courts that will anticipate Court A and Court F will recognize each other as courts and will say, look, if ever we come up with a dispute and we come up on the opposite side of this dispute, let's go to Court C, as in Trolley, and or take a random number. We'll have 15 courts that we all agree are legitimate courts, and we'll pick one of them, and their decision will be final, and that'll settle it. On the other hand, there might be bandit courts. Bandit courts are either too stupid to realize that they might be on opposite sides of an issue, or they say, I don't care, my way or the highway. And the point is that the bandit courts would have to fight everyone. They would have to fight other bandit courts and legitimate courts, whereas the legitimate courts would only have to fight bandit courts. And the point is that fighting is expensive. They'd have to pay more for their soldiers or their policemen. And presumably they would, go the way of the dodo bird. We wouldn't have too many of them, or at least it wouldn't be as bad as present government. So that's how it would be settled if you and I had a dispute as to whose wallet it was. Which is paradigm case of property rights.
All right, so let me see if I understand this. In the scenario where my court is not one of those courts that agrees to subsume its authority to Court C, right? Not your court, but a court that we mutually agree upon that would adjudicate our discrepancy.
Yes.
Assuming that my court is not one of those, really its legitimacy is just simply a function of how big of an army I have.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a function of how big the army is. I would
or
say
how much money I have, because you're saying that I would have to fight everybody, and it would go the way of the dodo board if I don't have a dodo bird, if I don't have enough money to support that army that could fight everybody.
Well, I don't think it's either a matter of guns or money. I think the pen is mightier than the sword because the pen determines in which way the sword is pointed. And I think legitimacy is very important. And, the whole society would look upon your court, not you, but your court as sort of as a bandit court and wouldn't have much legitimacy. I mean, even the mafia had some sort of legitimacy.
Okay, but let's say it doesn't. Let's say the society says, we're not going to legitimize your court. And I say, okay, I don't care. I didn't steal your wallet, according to my court, which I think is actually the only legitimate court. Then what happens?
Then it's war. Then we have a little bit of a fight.
So, I mean, I guess for me, what you're outlining is sort of like feudalism to me, right? I mean, and even before we get to that point, what's interesting to me is this notion of like, just the idea that you could, we call it a wallet, but let's say that, a house, or let's say not even a house, a piece of land, something that existed before you claimed ownership to it. When you claim ownership to something, aren't you basically just saying like, I have a legitimate right to exercise violence in the protection of this area that I have claimed for myself? And you've just sort of, that seems to me to be contrary to your non-aggression principle.
Well, I would offer you a friendly amendment. It's not so much feudalism. What you should have said is more Hobbesian, Hobbes, where it's a war of all against all. I imagine you'll accept that as a friendly amendment. Feudalism wasn't that warlike because the king would sort of tell the dukes to, shut up or something.
I imagine that's what would happen, though, in this scenario, right? Because that's what you were saying is that we would, if we didn't agree to Court C, well, Court C, it sounds like to me, is the king. You and I are the dukes, and there may be other courts that we function in that way, but whatever. Let's continue.
Well, I was just offering a friendly amendment that, it's really the Hobbesian world that you're alluding to, not so much the feudal. But if you want to stick to feudal, that's okay. And also, I agree with you. It doesn't really matter whether it's a wallet or a house or land or anything. I was just using as a wallet as a paradigm case of property that people could dispute over. But I disagree with you. And by the way, this debate that we're now having is a ferocious debate within libertarianism between the minarchists and the anarchists. And you are taking the minarchist point of view, and I will now take the anarchist point of view and say, look, the logical implication of your minarchist libertarian view, I'm glad I've converted you to minarchist libertarianism. I'm just kidding. Right now, China and Colombia are in a state of anarchy with each other. Right now, Brazil and Burundi are in a state of anarchy with each other. Right now, the U.S. and, Australia are in a state of anarchy because there's no world government. And logically, your position, if you say, well, if we have decentralized the police systems, you're going to have a Hobbesian or a feudal world. Well, the logical implication of that is we have to have a world government. Because if you're afraid that Court A and F will not abide by Court C, and each one will say my way or the highway, or I'm right and the hell with you, well then we really need a world government, because right now there's anarchy between about 250 countries, and yet of course there's a problem with world government. Namely, look, we're both Jewish. And we know that the Jews are wandering Jews. We wander from one place to another because, one dictator doesn't like us much. At least we go somewhere else. Hitler arises, or what's happening in France arises, and we go to Israel or the United States or somewhere else. But if there were one world government, and China and India, if it was democratic, those two countries would have a big say, and there'd be no place for us Jews to go to. So, and I don't mean to make it just a Jewish thing, but anyone who is on the outs from the powers that be likes the fact that we have a little bit of decentralization. Whereas you minarchist libertarians, Sam, are logically implied to favor world government, and I think that's a problem.
Well, I don't know that you've really addressed what I said. I mean, there are. I mean, I think the world is better off for having the UN. I think that there is. I wouldn't mind actually, and I don't have a problem with the series of sort of, I guess, of treaties and regimes that we have in the context of those regimes. They're not as enforceable, and then sometimes they do lead to war, and I do think that's problematic. But, things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, I agree. There's only so much that in the context of international relations that we can, when we're talking about major countries, that we can really create a regime that functions, and I think we're doing our best. But that doesn't really, that doesn't address the idea of property as it speaks now. I mean, when you have the ability, and in fact, look, that's when it is the notion of property and national boundaries, I agree on some level, is completely arbitrary, right? And it just so happens that's where the Chinese have enforced it through weapons, and same with the United States, I guess, too. But that doesn't address my question. How does the non-aggression principle reconcile itself with the idea that you can claim ownership of something? Because it is only that ownership, that property right that you exercise, is simply basically your way of saying, I have the ability to be aggressive if you attempt to take what I have decided is mine.
Well, you're sort of, I think, veering dangerously close to the argument of might makes right, and accusing me of favoring that view, that might makes right. But I don't uphold that view. My view is that there's justice and there's right, and sometimes justice and righteousness lose out in the war. I mean, sometimes the bad guys win, unhappily. So I don't think that might makes right. I think
where do property rights come from is really what I'm asking, I think. And how does that not involve aggression?
Well, you have to distinguish between violence and aggression, or violence and invasive aggression. I mean, libertarians are not pacifists. We don't believe, well, some might be pacifists, but you need not be a pacifist to be a libertarian. You can believe in self-defense or other defense. If I come after you with a knife, you have a right to shoot me because I'm violating your property rights in your person.
Well, wait a second. That's what's interesting to me, is that your personal integrity is a property right. That seems to me to be fairly arbitrary. I mean, if I take a knife, let's say, and walk onto your property and stab your ground, I don't think that that is the same as coming at you as a human being. But it seems like you're saying that those are the same things.
Well, I wouldn't say they're the same. I would say that they're both property rights. One is a much more important property right of mine, me, my body. And if you put a knife into my body, you're really violating a very, very important piece of my property right. On the other hand, if you just step on my lawn and maybe throw a knife into my lawn, well, yeah, I think you've also violated my property rights, but a much less important property right of mine.
Well, let me ask you this: we all I will, for the sake of argument, call them both property rights. But one is a property right that every single human being has, which is their own person by definition. Yeah. And the property right to what you consider your property, that to me seems to be not inherent in every person, because every person doesn't own a piece of land. So I'm curious. It's quite obvious how the first one is arrived at, because everybody is a human being. They are themselves. It's quite clear as to who they are. But how is it that you establish that you own this land without it being a function of violence?
Okay, well, let me answer it in this way, and I think that's a very important question. First, I don't know if it's a concession or not on your part. I think maybe it's not, but it's a very important point that you made, that we each own ourselves, because there are people who deny this. For example, the Nazis denied that Jews and gays and Romani and blacks and non-Aryans really own themselves. And the issue of slavery, there were some people who said that other people really don't own themselves, but we own them. And in the case of rape. The rapist, in effect, is saying to the rape victim, you don't really own, or at least all the property rights in your person. I own some of them, namely the right to abuse you in this sexual way. So that's a very important point. And from this, libertarians would deduce that slavery is an abomination, that kidnapping is an abomination, that rape is an abomination. But the point is that I have a right to self-defense. So again, I'm making you the bad guy. I hope you don't mind. First, I accused you of stealing my wallet. Now I'll accuse you of coming at me with a knife, as I did before. Now, if you come at me with a knife with the intent to stab me, you're in effect saying that I don't have a right to exist, namely that you own me, in effect, that you can determine what happens to me. And I can use violence. So libertarians are not against violence. I can use violence to ward off your attack. And so therefore, property rights imply violence, not only property rights in land and in wallets and in houses, but even in persons. Namely, suppose that there's this African guy and there's this white person who wants to enslave him and bring him to the United States. They're both using violence, only I would say one is using justified violence, namely defensive violence, and the other is using aggressive violence. And libertarians are only against aggressive violence. So that would be one point. The other point is, well, how do you get to own non-person property or non-human property? And here libertarians pretty much rely on John Locke, another famous philosopher, along with Hobbes. And what Locke said is, if you mix your labor with the land, you sort of imprint your personality on the land. So you go out, and you sort of homestead and you put in a crop and you take care of the land. You knock down a few trees, you get rid of a few rocks, and you put in a cornfield or something. Well, then you own that land. That would be the libertarian defense of that.
Well, okay. There's a couple things that stick out. One is, I think that from my perspective, calling one's personhood property is really sort of a semantics game that I think falls apart when you talk about like my right to exist. Because when I trespass on your property, from your perspective, I'm not questioning the right of that piece of land to exist. I'm just questioning your dominance over that land, which is clearly not a part of you. But how is it, if it's simply just a question of when you mix your labor with that property, it becomes yours, does that mean that if someone, I guess, inherits it, or if someone just doesn't do anything with the property, then there's no property right vested in it?
Well, no. I would say that Robert Nozick is sort of my guru or my mentor on this one. He talks about legitimate title transfers to property, and he says that any voluntary transfer is legitimate. For example, I put in this corn crop, and you domesticate a cow, and you capture the cow and you domesticate the cow, and now you get some milk out of the cow. And now what happens, I trade you some corn for some milk, and now I own the milk even though I didn't produce it, and you own the corn even though you didn't produce that. And yet I would say, along with Nozick and every other libertarian, that I now have a legitimate title to the milk because I can trace it back to an agreement with you to trade, have this barter, and also to original homesteading. Namely, you're the legitimate owner of the milk because you domesticated the cow, and I'm the legitimate owner of the corn because I, homesteaded the cornfield. So that would be one legitimate title transfer trade. Another one would be gifts. I give some corn to you as a birthday present. Or I give my son the cornfield as inheritance. That's just a gift after death, or a gift as you're passing away. Or gambling. I bet you on the Super Bowl, and I lose, and you get some corn. I bet you some corn against some milk, and that would be another legitimate title transfer. But the point is, suppose I now, homestead the cornfield, and then I go away for a year or so. Do I have to keep homesteading it? And that's a debate among libertarians. And in my view, is once you own it, period. And there's a very technical issue. Well, suppose you go away for 50 years, then, do you give up ownership? And I would say that's a very esoteric point among libertarians. But you can have, what do you call it, absentee landlords or absentee landowners. In other words, I now I homestead the cornfield, and now what I do is I rent it out to you. You're my farmer person. I make an arrangement with you. I'll let you you put the corn in. It's my field, but you put the corn in and you give me half the crop or something like that. You're a sharecropper. That would be a legitimate
But Professor,
contract.
I mean,